Thank you all.
So thank you, Walter. I'll let those excellent introductions stand. Thanks for having us here. I think for our purposes, I'll just remind you that we have the pleasure of talking this morning with two former directors of national intelligence. The first, John Negroponte, who started in 2005 and served for almost 2 years, and then the most recent, but for the serving director, James Clapper, Admiral Blair, who served between 2009 and 2010. We're going to take the prerogative to range a little bit farther than just the question of the DNI's role in counterterrorism, but let's start there because we're here because after 9/11, the 9/11 Commission and the Congress of the United States judged that the September 11 attacks had exposed weaknesses in the intelligence system that needed to be addressed by comprehensive reform. And one of the elements of that reform was the creation of the job that you occupied in 2005. So let me start with the basics, Ambassador. Was the impulse to reform the intelligence community, as reflected in that legislation and the creation of your job, was it well conceived?
I think it was well conceived. I think there's always an issue of whether passing important national security legislation in a presidential election year is a particularly good idea. I would cite another impetus for the reform, which was not only 9/11 itself. I think with just the pressure from the 9/11 families and the wake of all of that, I'm not sure we would have had the reform. I think what really sort of sent it over the top was the WMD fiasco and the curveball incident, and the fact that we basically accepted phony intelligence about the existence of WMD in Iraq. So yes, that's what caused the reform. My job, I had no role in that debate. I was actually minding my own business in downtown Baghdad in early 2005 when Andy Card called me up and asked me if I'd be willing to be the first director of national intelligence. And the first thing I had to do was print out the law on my computer because I hadn't really followed the debate, but yes, it happened. It was, I believe in dealing with the situation as it is, and I did the best I could to set the place up.
What did the president want you to do when he first described to you, given that Congress had delivered you to him as an office? What did he want you to do for him?
Well, I think the watchwords were coordination and integration. I would add the best possible coordination in real time of intelligence within the community. I was given various of the community management responsibilities that had rested with the CIA previously. I think he also looked to me, since it was bad analysis that had caused the WMD fiasco, I think he looked to me to play a strong leadership role in the analytic function across the entire community. And in that connection, I was a participant in his daily intelligence briefings and oversaw that whole operation.
So, Admiral, by the time this office passed down to you in 2009, there was a history of interagency activity in two wars. There was almost a decade of counterterrorism activity directed at Al-Qaeda. We've heard today quite a lot of optimistic talk about the strength of the interagency process, but there's this perpetual concern that our balkanized intelligence community is unable to share and cooperate adequately. When you arrived and as you oversaw the community, what's the scorecard that you would give to the degree of integration that's actually been achieved through the DNI?
I think that the fundamental impulse of the IRTPA was correct. I completely agree with Ambassador Negroponte. By its nature, the best intelligence integrates the information that you gain by various different methods in order to answer the needs of either a policymaker or an action officer in the field. You simply cannot do it in the old industrial way. It's a very interactive method. And there are two ways that you can achieve that, either by well-meaning cooperation of those who are involved in intelligence administration, or put somebody in charge and say, it's that person's job to set up the structures and the incentives to make that happen. I think the self-initiated way has strong limitations because there are many counter pressures having to do with budget, who gets the credit, bureaucratic prerogatives and all, and only putting a central authority to do that will you achieve the integration, which is characteristic of the very best intelligence that the United States does. I think we've been a little bit misled because the intelligence issues which led to the DNI revolved around 9/11 and terrorism. And we've heard an amazing amount of happy talk already in this seminar, in this Aspen forum, about how everybody gets together and everybody's been working together for 10 years and isn't it wonderful, we all know each other and so on. And that's true. That's true. And underlying that is this searing sense of guilt and shame about 9/11 and the determination never to let it happen again. That is the engine that's really driving the sort of cooperation and good results that we have achieved recently. But that is no substitute for an integrated intelligence operation in which the incentives and the authorities and the budgets are all lined up in order to integrate the various aspects of intelligence on all the intelligence questions that we face, not just a tactical terrorist organization. So I'm very much in favor of it. I would say that we have taken a step back in recent years in terms of that. When this administration came in, it had not personally gone through the debates that led to IRTPA, the early formation difficulties of that. Director Panetta had been out in California. President Obama was not in national office yet. There are a few other people who were involved in it, and I think there's a lack of understanding of this in this administration of the requirements to get the incentives, the organization, the authorities correct in order to integrate intelligence. It just doesn't happen by itself.
Well, so one very important test case of that would be whether or not the DNI should have authority to oversee and coordinate covert action in addition to analysis and other intelligence functions. And my understanding is that during your time you proposed such tighter integration and didn't come to pass. And I think the two of you have different views about the desirability of locating in a central office like the DNI IC-wide authority over covert action. Could you make the case for it, Admiral Blair, and then Ambassador maybe respond with your own thoughts about the costs and benefits of such an approach?
Well, to go back to a higher level question, I think the entire concept for covert action should be revisited, and we should have new legislation to authorize it. If you recall, covert action was invented during the Cold War in order that the President of the United States could deny that the United States was doing something that it actually was doing. And the reason for denying that was it was generally directed against the Soviet Union, and we did not want to get into an escalatory set of actions with the Soviet Union that might lead to thermonuclear war. So while we and the Soviets, the KGB and the CIA and the intelligence agencies were kicking each other in the stomach under the table, we were smiling at each other and saying, no, we don't do that. That's not our business. That situation has entirely changed now. There are ungoverned areas of the world in which the United States needs to take action, and this action should be secret, but it should not be deniable. The raid that we heard about for Osama bin Laden was done under covert action authorities. If there was any operation in the history of the United States that was not going to be denied, that was it. And yet we did it under covert action authorities. And my experience is when you find that you have to take the existing legislation, the authorities, the procedures that you have, and twist them so badly in order to do the job that obviously has to be done by the circumstances involved, you ought to go back and change the legislation and do it. So I'm very much in favor of looking overall at what direct action should be, at setting up a new structure to do it, at having new legislation as to how we handled it, and I very much believe that the Director of National Intelligence should be a part of that system.
Ambassador?
Well, Couple of points. First, having been almost, I would say, a victim in some respects, reputationally at least, when I was ambassador to Honduras with regard to the whole Contra operation in Nicaragua, which was a major covert action, although, as the Admiral points out, it didn't. The covertness didn't last very long. The cover got blown within 8 or 9 months, but then we had to live with the residual political impact of that for years thereafter. So I have familiarity that goes back pretty far in my career. But I'd like to come back to a basic point about what intelligence is. I have my own one-sentence definition of intelligence that I use with my students, which is the following. It is that intelligence is the collection and analysis of information for the purposes of statecraft. That, to me, is the essence of intelligence, collection and analysis. There's nowhere in my lexicon that says that covert action is an intelligence function. It happens to have evolved that way in the history of our government, and with the devolution of various kinds of covert actions to the CIA by the President of the United States. And when I was Director of National Intelligence, and in part based on my experience going all the way back to Honduras, I was not the world's greatest enthusiast for expanding covert action authorities. I had nothing against the existing ones, and we won't go into what they were, but I was not one of those chomping at the bit to see them expanded. Should the CIA be the agency that does that? As far as I'm concerned, that is the decision and the prerogative of the President of the United States to organize covert action the way he wishes to do it. He could do it through the agency, or he can do it through various mechanisms in the Department of Defense. Where I join ranks with Admiral Blair is that I think we should have a good discussion of covert action in the future, and I think the time may have come for a review of what covert action is, when it ought to be used, how, under what authorities, and by whom.
But if I'm the President of the United States and I accept your definition of intelligence, that it's the collection and analysis of information in service of my statecraft as Commander-in-Chief, wouldn't I be concerned in the current setup that the gap between what operators are doing out in the field in covert action, let's say in the Fatah, that granular feel they have for what al-Qaeda is up to, who's in leadership, where their networks are pointing, that's not integrated into the DNI's authority. The DNI is not living, breathing, and smelling that operating information every day. There's still a gap in our system. So when you come in and give me the PDB, you're working secondhand with what the operators are willing to kind of offer you up.
It wasn't exactly secondhand. I'm making a distinction between a policy role and an operational role. That's a distinction we make all the time. And to go back to what Admiral McRaven said yesterday evening, and maybe in a little bit of at variance with Admiral Blair, I would say the personal relationships really matter. I don't think that the director of the CIA, during the time I was DNI and meeting with the President every day, 6 days a week, was ever going to keep from me information relevant to either the conduct of an existing covert action or particularly the development of thinking about new covert actions, where I feel I had a very clear understanding that any new covert action was not going to be approved without my input. So I think that this goes to the issue of whether you have directive authority, and I did not believe that I ought to have directive authority for any intelligence agency's activities beyond the boundaries of the Beltway, frankly.
So, Admiral, even if it's not a gap that should concern the President of the United States, do you believe it is a gap in the system, that the operators and the DNI are not integrated in the way that I gather you propose they might be?
Well, there's some subtleties here that that come into play. Covert action, by its nature, is very tactical. It's a series of operations or so. My experience is when you supervise tactical operations at a very high level in the White House, they gain importance that is much more than their inherent worth has. I compare it to special operations, which are every bit as high-wire, difficult, and sensitive as are many of the intelligence community's covert actions. And yet, because they are planned by tacticians, then approved at various levels up the chain in the Department of Defense, finally approved by the Secretary of Defense, and then in many cases going to the White House, they are sort of put it in the perspective of the overall policies and actions that the United States is taking on particular issues and in particular countries. On covert action, the way it's set up now, these very tactical level things are mainlined straight into the White House. I think it gives them an undue weight and lack of integration with what else is going on. So I think, as a practical matter, putting the DNI in the approval chain for them would give a degree of integration into the overall activities of government, which I think is desirable. The argument that you hear about that against that is, oh, that'll slow everything down, there'll be this ponderous bureaucracy of the DNI. That simply does not happen in the Department of Defense, where these things are handled very quickly. It could be handled very quickly with a small, competent staff in the ODNI, and I think having the DNI's input would be very, very strong. By way of background, I had run far more operations in Headley on Panetta, and yet the operations went through him, not through me. So in the main case of skills, fitting into the overall framework, and trying to make an integrated set of actions for the whole government, I think there's a role for the DNI, who is by the IRTPA put in charge of supervising the CIA for that role.
So I want to take your concern about the sort of overwhelming effect of tactical and operating information flowing into the White House and the extent to which it may distort the ability of the president's advisors to focus outside of that operating flow on the bigger picture, and use that as a way to turn to a discussion of strategic intelligence with both of you a little bit. And Admiral, last year here, I think you said something to the effect, I wrote this down from a wire service account of your remarks then, that in expressing your concern about the overemphasis on tactical operations and particularly the use of drones and kinetic strikes against terrorist groups, you expressed the view that we're treating countries just as places where we go attack groups that threaten us, and so we're threatening the prospects of long-term reform in some of those countries. This is the familiar tension between short-term security threats to the United States in places like Pakistan or Yemen and the need to build a more durable strategy for those countries that will make it less likely that such threats arise on a regular basis. If I've characterized your views correctly, do you think we're making progress in that direction, or are we still overwhelmed by that dilemma? What are the practical steps that the next president, whether it's a re-elected or a new president, could take to address some of the concerns that you've outlined?
I think it's gotten worse. And to me, the most damning thing I've heard in the last 3 or 4 hours we've been together is when Matt Olson and Mike Leiter said, well, the strategic operational planning function of NCTC really needs to be developed. That's code for we don't have a strategy. That's what that is really saying. This is a secular trend. It's not this administration. It's other administrations. The idea that doing a whole lot of tactical operations that keep you very busy and all will add up to getting to the endpoint that you seek, which is what strategy is all about. And we are consumed by the tactics, and we're not thinking about the strategy. The ultimate strategy for winning the battle against Al-Qaeda, of course, is to have stable countries in which terrorism is not an attractive alternative for the young men and women of that country, in which they can have some sense of their own government, in which these radical nihilist ideologies are outliers, not mainline popular kinds of thinking. And the Arab Spring has given us a tremendous opportunity to be able to move that direction. Who are the people who are in Al-Qaeda? They come from Yemen. They come from Egypt. They come from Libya. What are the countries that have a chance of becoming representative governments in which the frustrations of these people can be handled by internal improvements and so on? So our long-term goal of getting out of this business of pinging away at terrorists around the world is very clear in front of us. That is a strategic thought. We do have things we have to do in the near term that are tactical and near term, but those should always be done in the idea of how do we transition to the more permanent state, which is going to be the best thing for the country. That discussion ought to be constant. Those questions ought to be asked by high-level decision makers continually, not how did we do against Abu bin so-and-so yesterday, and is he a threat tomorrow, and where's the next little cell coming from? And I don't see any of that being done by the higher levels of our government, which ought to be the National Security Council, the White House. I see this incredible tactical focus, reactive, gets us in the present, manages to work against our long-term goals in many cases by alienating the very people whose cooperation we need to beat it in the long term. And I just don't think things have gotten better.
So, Ambassador, you served a different president, but what is your judgment about the quality of our strategic intelligence, apart from tactical warning, the ability to support operations at wartime and so forth? Obviously, those are critical functions when the country's at war, but what is the quality of our strategic intelligence?
Well, I think it's good, but it's one of the areas which the reform sought to move at least some of those functions over to the Office of the ODNI, the Office of National Intelligence Estimates, the so-called National Intelligence Council. These are bodies of analysts who are charged with looking at some of these medium and longer term problems. If I could just step back for a moment, though, I think if you consider the hollowing out of our national security establishment during the 1990s and the state we found ourselves in 2001 on the occasion of 9/11 was that we had degraded a lot of our capabilities across the board in the national security community, and that certainly held true as regards analysts and as it regarded covert intelligence collectors and so on and so forth, so that this took a huge investment to start rebuilding those capabilities. We heard yesterday from Admiral Olson some of the excellent work that's been done in terms of our tactical capabilities, and I think we've really perfected certain types of special operations activities which actually do serve as the pointed edge of the pointed end of the spear in terms of concentrating and integrating all different forms of intelligence against a specific objective. The harder challenge, and Admiral Blair is suggesting it, is how do you deal with this slightly more nebulous but nonetheless very important area about thinking about our strategic situation in the future? They created a sort of a long-range analytic unit in the office of the Director of National Intelligence, but that's a very modest in size. I think this is a community-wide challenge, and I think part of it requires making sure that we recruit and maintain and keep and nurture our analysts for a long period of time. We can't go back to the days in the early 2000s when some of the analysts in these various agencies had only 2, 3, 4 years, 5, maybe at best 10 years experience analyzing their area of responsibility. We need China experts, Iran experts, Arab language officers. These are skills that take time to cultivate and nurture, and I think that we just have to keep working on that. I reflect back to my Cold War experience, and I think of what I think perhaps was the most important intelligence failure of the Cold War, which was that Lyndon Johnson and Dean Rusk did not fully appreciate the significance of the Sino-Soviet split. They went through a whole decade, the 1960s, with the Sino-Soviet split staring them right in the face, and they never thought up the tactics and the strategies to exploit that division between China and the Soviet Union. It took the arrival of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger to accomplish that. Admittedly, there were some events that forced the issue a bit more with the open clashes between the Soviets and the Chinese, but that dispute and that split had been there for a whole decade, and we didn't exploit it. So we've got some big analytic issues out there in the future. China, what its intentions are, is our relationship going to be a positive-sum or zero-sum game, just to cite one, and then the other, perhaps referring back to what Admiral Blair talked about, the whole issue of nation-building, draining the swamp with regard to terrorism. What works best? We have a lot of bad experiences to refer back to in terms of how poorly we really seem to have done in the past years in the whole realm of nation building. And what does it take, and what will it take, and should it take for the United States to be more effective in that regard going forward? And this is a bit more than just an intelligence issue. It's a national security and a policy issue, I think.
And a critical one. So just to stay on this track one more take, and thinking about the role of secret information in the quality of thinking and analysis that's available to consumers of intelligence from the White House across cabinet departments. We often hear that there's a bias in the community toward secret information at the expense of other information or of the kind of recognition strategies that you alluded to when you described the failure to see the Sino-Soviet split. Let me ask you both this question. This is a very sophisticated audience. Let's stipulate that everybody in this room reads the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal every morning, and at night they turn on the BBC's World Service News Hour for an hour, and they listen to France 24 for an additional hour. And then every morning they come into the White House and they read the PDB. Now, at least half of us have never read the PDB on a regular basis. If we read it for a year while having those information consumption habits, what would we think about the quality and the nature of the PDB?
Well, Admiral Blair and I both had the experience of going and giving an unclassified version of the annual intelligence assessment to the Congress, and they always look at it, and some of the wise guys there say, well, there's nothing in here that you couldn't find out from reading the press. Yeah, but the fact of the matter is we validated whatever you read through our intelligence sources and methods, and it therefore should have a higher degree of credibility. But to come back to your question, before I went to brief the president or accompany the intelligence briefers who briefed him every day, I started out by listening to the radio, then I read the New York Times and the Washington Post, and then and only then at 6:30 in the morning, I go into the office to reread the president's daily brief, which I'd seen a draft of the night before. So I think open source intelligence and general knowledge is extraordinarily important, and it's 95% of what you carry around. But there obviously are critical bits and pieces and elements of information that you can only get in a classified manner. And then there are, of course, societies, very often ones that tend to be our most significant adversaries, that practice denial and deception, and about whom it is very hard to get reliable information, whether you're talking about North Korea or Iran or what have you. So intelligence does play a critical role, and with the resources and capabilities we have at our disposal, we'd be fools to just make policy on the basis of only openly available information. I did, when I became ODNI, plus up the so-called open source function. We took what used to be known as the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which a lot of us senior citizens used to use to write our term papers in college, because it was such a reliable reporter of what was being said in the foreign press. But we've taken that and we've given it additional resources to make it more of an open source information center, and I think that's enjoyed a measure of success.
Admiral, what's the value added
I always felt that as DNI, one of my main responsibilities in a democracy like the United States was to make sure that the educated understanding of the big security problems facing the United States was consistent in the open source and what we knew with the addition of classified intelligence sources on big questions like what is Iran up to with its nuclear program, on big questions like what is China about. I think it's wrong in a democracy if you have an educated open source set of ideas that is at variance with what we know from our classified means of getting material. So I was very...
And did those gaps open up in your experience?
I felt that you could have a very good idea of those big, important questions in the United States from reading the press and listening to the radio. And I thought that was a good thing because you have to have the right understanding of what's really going on in the world in order to support the right policies. I agree with Ambassador Negroponte that border between experts and intelligence analysts has gotten weaker, and I think it's a good thing. We bring in, for instance, the national intelligence estimates are the sort of our highest level intelligence community considerations of an important national security question, and for each of those, we bring in a number of outside experts to read them through at the end and say, did we have it right? Did we miss anything? And then the views of these outside experts are then brought forward as part of the national intelligence estimates. And I found very few cases in which the outside experts said this is completely wrong. It was generally a matter of emphasis and intonation. I thought that was a good thing. So I think they go pretty well together, and we benefit a lot. Just personal anecdotes. Every so often, I would get an article from a reputable, send it down to my analysts, and say, what do you think? And do they have it right, or do they not have it right? And so it does play into what we do, and it's positive.
So just to circle back to the subject of counterterrorism and ask you both a specific question about some of the discourse we've heard earlier today, and that's also around in the ecosystem in Washington, which is about Al-Qaeda's strategic position today and whether or not it has been in some meaningful sense strategically defeated, even if we concede, as many speakers have emphasized, that its resilience and its ideology suggest it will always pose some sort of threat. There's still an important question about how a president of the United States should be thinking about the strategic nature of that threat. So I want to ask the question of each of you in two ways. First, what is your own judgment about the extent to which we can say Al-Qaeda has been defeated strategically? And then if you were DNI today and I asked you to task the intelligence community to come back with a full-throated view of that question, if I'm the president, should I regard our enemy as in some meaningful way defeated? How would you task that question? What is it that the president should hear about in order to evaluate whether or not we're at some turning point in our contest with Al-Qaeda?
Well, I certainly think, Mike Sheehan, I thought, gave us a good definition and discussion of Al-Qaeda. I believe it was he. And I thought it was very good. Where I came in on this initially was when I went to Iraq as ambassador, and Al-Qaeda was a real menace. We had this character, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the Jordanian guy, and he was a fanatic, and he got organized Fallujah, and it turned into basically Al-Qaeda Central in Iraq, and they were administering Sharia law and everything else. And the country, I thought, was in pretty dire straits at that particular point in time, and we had, if our policies were going to work in that country, we had to liberate Fallujah, which is what we ultimately did in November, December of 2004. And I think since that time, with the magnificent work of Stanley McChrystal, the United States Army generally, the Special Operations Forces, incredible work has been done on reducing the Al-Qaeda threat in Iraq. I think they've also, as was mentioned by Mike Leiter and others, I think that they've been diminished in South Asia, although now they've spilled over into some of these other areas that were mentioned, whether it's Yemen or Somalia or so forth. But I think it's a diminished force from what it was at the time of 9/11. They've lost their symbolic leader, which I think is important, but they're not a threat to be completely dismissed. I think maybe some of the fringe groups affiliated with al-Qaeda might even be more of a threat. I worry about Lashkar-e-Taiba. I worry particularly, if I was lying awake at night in government now, I'd wonder about what would we do, or what would India do if Mumbai were again attacked by extremists who had been supported and staged out of Pakistan? What if there's a second Mumbai attack, as there was in 2008? So I think there's still problems to be worried about. I think they're more in terms of what affects United States interests abroad rather than in terms of a threat to the United States homeland, which I believe to be substantially diminished.
Admiral?
I think in evaluating al-Qaeda, the way to think about it is what can they do? And I sort of draw three rough levels of capability. Multi-team, big attacks that would kill thousands of Americans. What happened on 9/11. Sort of small team, half a dozen people, the explosives and other weapons that you can gather clandestinely that would probably kill a couple of dozen Americans. A single disgruntled individual who might be able to do what this clown in Aurora, Colorado did. I think that al-Qaeda is now down somewhere between that second stage I described and the third stage I described. The level of resources which the United States is devoting to that problem is about the same as it was 8 years ago when we started it. And I think the real question is that the right level of resources for the future, or are there other ways to deal with this? I think the defensive capabilities that the United States now has, with the improvements the Department of Homeland Security has made, with the tremendous work that the FBI has done in terms of working in this country, I think the United States is a lot tougher target than it was in the past. And whereas 10 years ago, being quite ignorant of what this threat was, we did everything. We went on offense, we went on defense, we just went after it the way Americans always do. And I think it's time now to look at that balance again between toughness, resources, the level of al-Qaeda we think we can tolerate this. And by the way, the other consideration here is if we need to get to a higher level of capability against that, even that single person target, the cost in civil liberties and privacy, which we would have to pay in order to be able to do the sort of intrusive measures that would get our intelligence and understanding down to that level, is that a price we want to pay compared to other things? So I think we need to step back and think strategically about this thing in terms of our objective, our resources, the capabilities, and the things that we've done. And I would hope that would be taking place now. Nothing I've heard so far from our government representative friends makes me think that is going on now.
Sure.
One comment about resources. I was ambassador to the Philippines in the 1990s, and in January of 1995, because they made a mistake experimenting with some chemicals, a group of terrorists got caught in this so-called Bojinka plot, which was designed to both blow up 12 trans-Pacific airliners, kill the Pope, who was going to visit the Philippines a few days later. And it turned out that one of the masterminds, well, two of the masterminds were Ramzi Youssef of this plot, and the other was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And they both they escaped from the site of where a lot of these materials were ultimately discovered. And there was also a fellow, I think his name was Murad, who had written out a whole plot to fly aircraft into the CIA building. This is 1995, mind you. Well, that's all history, and you can look that stuff up. But what you don't know is that my station chief came in to me a few days later in Manila and said, oh, by the way, I've just gotten an order to cut the station in half because of right-sizing in government and the straightening out of our, the cutting costs in our national security establishment. And imagine that. Of course, at that time, we weren't aware that we were watching the precursor of 9/11. It was happening right in front of our eyes. We had no way of knowing it at that particular point in time. So all I'm saying is, as we think about right-sizing in the future, I associate myself with what Admiral Olson said yesterday. I hope we don't sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater. I'm nothing against having a look at all these things and what's the right mix and deployment of resources, but let's not cut too far too fast.
Great. We've got a little over 10 minutes left, so time to turn to the audience. And quickly. Sure.
A very important player in all of this who is not represented at this conference is Congress. And one of the things I noted as DNI, which I think extends more widely, is that in so many of these areas that we've been talking about, the legislation under which we operate is so antiquated that we have to do triple backflips and tremendous contortions in order to be able to get very simple jobs done. I would just point to three areas in which I really think we need new legislation. One is cybersecurity. There is a bill that's in Congress right now. It's okay for a first step, but the key asymmetry of the cyber capability of this country, which is located primarily in the National Security Agency, and the responsibility for protecting the networks of this country outside of the Department of Defense, which lies at the Department of Homeland Security, has not been bridged by that legislation, and that's the key question that has to be done. Second one, I've argued for many years, we need a Title 60, which combines the capabilities of Special Forces with, well, the Department of Defense more generally, and the CIA's covert authorities, to be able to put them into integrated task forces to get the job done, instead of these bizarre situations which you have, in which you have a defense task force and an intelligence task force, both of which are working on the same piece of property, and they're exchanging liaison officers, and they're holding each other's coats, and they're doing all of the things that you do when you have good working relationships, but it's no substitute for an integrated group that brings together the capabilities and authorities of all of them. And the third one, I would say, is that we need a tremendous change in the degree to which we want U.S. government agencies, domestic and foreign, to be able to make use of the communications of Americans, whether they be by phone or email. Right now, it's a hodgepodge of different authorities, different ideas. The poor FBI agents and NSA officials who have to go through these contortions in order to get obvious things done have to be seen to be believed. And we are neither protecting the privacy of Americans, nor are we being particularly effective in getting information on the bad people. So there are three big things we need to do.
So I'm going to break protocol spontaneously, looking out in the audience, and instead of immediately inviting questions, I'm going to call on two people to respond to this panel for 2 minutes. Director McLaughlin, you can husband your thoughts. And General Hayden, if you would be willing, from your perspective, would you say something in reply to the discourse you've heard about the relationship between the DNI and the CIA?
Yeah.
Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah, thanks for the surprise, Steve. What I would simply say is there's no one who's actually doing this, and I think it includes the Admiral and the Ambassador, who wants Congress to go back under the hood and start pulling out carburetor wires again. Right? That we have a structure, and that we can make this structure work. And in my view, it depends on three things. One, obviously the DNI. Two, the relationship of the DNI to the President, which has to be close. And three, the relationship of the DNI to the DCIA. And when I was working for Ambassador Negroponte, I put CIA on the same line as those other big 5 collection agencies, NRO, NSA, and so on. And even before I had any inkling I'd be going to Langley, it was clear to me that CIA was different, and that the success of this overall depended more on the relationship of the DNI and the DCIA than it did with any of the other big, massive collection and analytic agencies. And there I thought the magic was that the DNI needed to offer the DCIA a lot of running room, and the DCIA had to guarantee the DNI total transparency in terms of what the agency was doing. And if you did those things, you could make the current structure with all of its flaws and shortfalls, you could make it work.
Director McLaughlin, is the CIA different, and if so, how?
Well, there's nothing in America that's more different than the CIA. I mean, let's start with that. Yes, it's different, but I would agree with everything Mike said, and my reflection on this would be the following. I was among those who opposed the creation of the DNI quite publicly. Once the president made the decision to do that, I think all of us who were in that position swung to the view that this has to work, and in order for that to work, this person has to be empowered in a very significant way. I think the initial legislation was a little anemic in that regard, to understate it, in terms of the authorities given to the DNI. Mike has laid out some of the things that make the DNI work effectively with the CIA. But over time, here's how I would see it. This is a lot like the creation of the CIA in a way. If you go back to the 1947 period when the CIA was created, it was not a well-understood concept. It was not approved broadly. There were fights between the military and the State Department over what this new thing was. And the director of the CIA had to, over time, say by the early 50s, establish the identity and function and place of this agency. In a way, that's what the DNIs have had to do. And I'll tell you where I am now. I think of Director Negroponte as someone who came in at a time when there was great turmoil and a lot of trouble in the community. He calmed the community down. Director McConnell had important accomplishments largely in the area of modernizing the FISA legislation. Director Blair brought an attention to community affairs and looking across all of these agencies that moved the process forward, and the current DNI, General Clapper, I think, has gotten close to the idea that was behind the creation of the DNI by emphasizing one word, integration. Now, initially, a lot of people said, what does that mean? I think someone the other day defined it pretty well. It means interoperability. And I think the community is now more interoperable than it was at the time the DNI was created. So all of that advances the intelligence enterprise. Your first question, is the CIA unique? Yes, it is. I mean, it is the only agency that combines 4 qualities, I think, in full measure. First, it's global. A lot of our agencies are. Second, it's interdisciplinary, economics, politics, military. You can staff a small college from the place, every discipline. It's all source. People there see everything. And maybe the most important thing is it is non-departmental. The only agency that is not affiliated with a department that makes or implements policy, and therefore it has a certain independence by its charter that is not lacking in other agencies, but is sort of heightened in the agency. And the legislation said that the DNI, that the CIA should report to the DNI. It stops short of full control, but it does establish that's the place the DNI probably reaches first when the DNI wants to have an impact across the whole community. These 2 DNIs can correct me if I'm wrong. And covert action, I'll stop there because we can come to that in a later panel, but I have very strong views on how that should work and why it works well and why it doesn't work well.
Great. Thank you both for offering those comments. We've got time for a few more questions, and I'll let the 2 of them also have a last say about the 2 interventions. Yes?
At the risk of repeating the same question earlier, Steve Shapiro, you heard the discussion before about the domestic intelligence side. The 2004 legislation defines terrorism information as including domestic terrorism information and domestic threats to the United States, even beyond terrorism, in the way we think of it. So there's no question that domestic is part of the DNI's responsibility. Can you two comment on how much attention you paid to the domestic side of intelligence and its coordination amongst agencies when you were running the shop, and perhaps comment on where we ought to go? You might have heard Mike Leiter's remark that we need a DNI, or at least a deputy DNI, who has some domestic intel or law enforcement experience, so as to emphasize this aspect. Thank you.
Great. Admiral, why don't you start with that, since you're the most up to date about where things have gotten.
Right. Let me try to illustrate it by an example. What you try to do in intelligence is take a shard of information and build it into a fuller picture. So let's say we get a report that a young Nigerian has terrorist ideas and has some knowledge of the United States. So what you'd like to be able to do is to put a query out from a single analyst that says, I'd like a list of all Nigerians under this age who have ever visited the United States, what other little pieces of information you have. And back would come a list of maybe 10 or 12 individuals, and then you turn it over to your investigative office that you'll have and try to find if one of those 10 or 12 was actually a threat. In order to establish that part of a potential threat's activities which happen in this country, you need to go to the records of the Immigration and Nationalization Service and be able to query those by name. You'd like to go to a list that shows all students enrolled in countries in the United States from foreign countries. If you got a hit, you'd like to be able to find out what the credit card history of that person was. You'd like to know if that person had any traffic accidents, any licenses. So by the nature of trying to track down a threat, you are deep into information that is held by domestic agencies for completely other purposes, but it's very useful for identifying a threat. In theory, by law, the DNI can designate. I designate that the traffic violation records of Colorado are national security sources of information because they might give us a clue on a terrorist, and that ought to be instantly available to the intelligence community in order to track down and narrow a threat. So we are not to that point yet, nor am I sure that we really want to get to that point. And it's that uneasy balance between how much of the information that's collected by federal, state, and local officials can be instantly accessed, queried by search machines run by people out of the National Intelligence Center that you want to do. And there's an uneasy balance there between privacy and national security, which still I think has to be worked.
So how do you see the role of the DNI?
Let me just, because I'm afraid I've lost control of the clock, and so I'm going to have to just take 3 quick questions from others and get some comments, and then I'd hate to stand between you and lunch, so I'll move quickly. There's a woman there. We'll just gather the questions together, and then I'll let each of the panelists respond to the ones that they would wish to.
Hi, Catherine Herridge, Fox News. Are we winning the war of ideas? And if not, why not?
Good simple question. Anyone else want to stick a hand up real quickly before lunch? Boy, you're hungry. Okay. If either of you would like to address that, and then say anything you wish to follow on the earlier question or the comments from General Hayden and Director McLaughlin, and we'll wrap up.
I think we're winning the war of ideas through no fault of our own, but because we have the right ideas. I was just so heartened by young Tunisians, Egyptians, Jordanians, Bahrainis, Saudis saying that, hey, we want to be in charge of our future. We want to choose our leaders. We're tired of this putting up with, and that's what Americans believe in. And sort of puncturing that final barrier of Arabs can't be Democrats, preceded by, Asians can't be Democrats, preceded by, South Americans can't be Democrats. I mean, the idea that representative government, which is what America stands for, is so powerful, is I think, means we're winning the war of ideas despite our best efforts. So I'm all for that. On the exchange between, former Director Hayden and former Director McLaughlin, I guess I would say, yes, we can walk on a broken leg with a very good cast, and if we're careful and all, but my tradition is fix the damn thing. Get the authorities and right. And I will admit that I am prejudiced by the Department of Defense experience under Goldwater-Nichols. I heard so many times back in fact, I was on the other side of most of those arguments because I was a young commander about, the Navy is special, the Marine Corps is special. The Air Force can't possibly be run by somebody who hasn't been raised in the Air Force. And that was all nonsense. Nonsense. You put people together in integrated teams and you give them a mission and magic happens in the United States. Magic happens. And we should create a structure that enables that makes that the norm, not sit around with 100 phone calls from people who happen to be buddies from the time to do that. If you have that on top of a good structure, you get magic on top of magic. Otherwise, you're shortchanging your abilities, and I think we ought to keep driving towards more integrated intelligence across the line, from a collection to analysis to operations.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Just on the domestic side, I think that's a subject that makes those of us whose focus and experience in life has all been about foreign policy, foreign intelligence, very uneasy. And it really came home during my time and Mike Hayden's time as my deputy when the NSA program with respect to monitoring phone calls from Al-Qaeda and others from outside the United States into the U.S. Came to light, and all the controversy that generated. And I've got to say, I was truly impressed by all the safeguards that were built into that program, legal and otherwise. And I gather there's even been, I haven't looked at the new FISA legislation, but I'm sure there have been improvements. But I got to say, if I ever had to go back into any of that kind of work, I still would not be very comfortable working on the domestic side of things. And I think it's different enough that I just as soon leave it to another set of people and just have some kind of general oversight role.
Thank you both for your candor and your intelligence, as well as your public service, and thank you all for your attention. Lunch is served.